This is Scott Eyman, author of Print the Legend, The Life of John Ford, and John Ford, The Complete Films, welcoming you to Stagecoach, one of the early landmarks in the most remarkable directorial career in American movies. Stagecoach so faultlessly combines all the primal attributes of the Western, and so few of its faults, that it might be said to be not a Western, but the Western. If the emotional savagery and neuroticism of Ford's The Searchers defines the post-war Western, then the idealism and clarity of Stagecoach defines the pre-war Western. It redefined and elevated the genre, set the parameters and archetypes that the form would follow or reject for the next 30 years. Stagecoach marked the beginning of the most remarkable run any movie director has ever had. In the space of 2.5 years, John Ford would direct 7 films. 3 would be acknowledged masterpieces: Stagecoach, The Grapes of Wrath, and How Green Was My Valley. 2 would be merely excellent: The Long Voyage Home and Young Mr. Lincoln. And 1 a highly professional entertainment, Drums Along the Mohawk. He would win 2 consecutive Academy Awards for Best Director, and by the time he left Hollywood for service in World War II, John Ford would be at the pinnacle of his profession. The modern Western begins here. It begins with Stagecoach. The story of Stagecoach begins on April 10th, 1937, when Ernest Haycox published a short story called Stage to Lordsburg in Collier's magazine. John Ford quickly bought the movie rights. Soon thereafter, he hired Dudley Nichols, the prestigious screenwriter of The Informer, to adapt the Haycox story into a screenplay. The Ford and Nichols adaptation of Stage to Lordsburg differs significantly from Haycox's original. All the character names are changed, for one thing. The whore, Henrietta, becomes Dallas, and the good bad man, Malpay's Bill, becomes the Ringo Kid. The man on the right of the screen, holding his cowboy hat in his hand, is Yakima Canute, the great stuntman whose work in the climactic chase sequence is so revelatory. The Indian that we just had a nice close-up of is Chief John Bigtree, who also played the Indian chief in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon about 8 years later. Geronimo. The plot skeleton of the 2 stories is essentially the same, but characters are added, as is the entire subplot of the Ringo Kid seeking revenge against Luke Plummer. In the Haycox original, there's no driving motivation, as is being planted right here in the first few scenes of the movie. No one wants to chase anybody out of Tonto in the very beginning, and the stage hasn't been running for 45 days, so everybody is aware that they're traveling at their own risk. Ford adds urgency, and he deepens the characters of all the people we're going to be introduced to in the next few minutes. In the Haycox story, for instance, Lucy Mallory, the soldier's wife, is only engaged to her soldier, not married, thus not pregnant. Dudley Nichols' script establishes 2 primary plot threads: the travel through the dangers of Indian country and the Ringo Kid's quest for revenge. Unlike conventional dramaturgy, there really isn't an A story or a B story in Stagecoach. The one plot strand in Stagecoach is dependent upon the other. Now, although critics later poo-pooed Ford's claim that the story derives from de Maupassant's Bout de Souffle, the 2 stories both feature an acute class consciousness between ordinary people and the vanities and pretensions of those who imagine themselves to be pillars of society. One thing is certain: Ford didn't deviate much from Nichols' script, which is to a great extent the film. There are a few touches, the scene at the end of the film, for instance, where Luke Plummer staggers into the saloon after the shootout only to fall dead, that isn't in the script, and neither is the last dialogue in the film between Doc Boone and Curly. The Breen office rejected the treatment completely. It sympathetically portrayed a prostitute and an alcoholic, and it sanctioned violent revenge. Ford and Nichols gave a little. The final script never specifically refers to Dallas's occupation, although it can be intuited from the murderous looks the respectable biddies give Claire Trevor in this next scene. And they planted information about Luke Plummer's murderous past, which makes his death a question of retribution. The Breen office, in turn, gave a little on the matter of Doc Boone's flamboyant alcoholism. There's been an idea promoted over the years that nobody was making westerns when John Ford made Stagecoach. That's not exactly true. Cecil B. DeMille had made The Plainsman just 2 years before, a very successful, big, lavish DeMille take on the Western. Now, in this sequence between George Bancroft, Curly, leaning back in the chair, and the wonderful Andy Devine, who plays the stagecoach driver, you'll notice it's very sharply shot and edited. There's not a line more than there needs to be in terms of exposition. All the characters are being introduced very, very economically. To return to the point about the state of the Western in 1939, what was not in existence at this point was what might loosely be termed the adult Western. There was a profusion of Saturday afternoon Westerns with Gene Autry and Charles Starrett and the like, and you had the occasional big, lavish epic. But no one was inhabiting the middle ground, the quality Western for adults. That, essentially, is the niche that Ford was hacking out for himself, here with Stagecoach. In this sequence, we're introduced to Gatewood, the banker who is absconding with some of the funds. His line about what's good for the banks is good for the country makes him out to be the archetypal windbag conservative. Gatewood is an addition to Haycock's original story. In other words, Nichols and Ford made him up, doubtless for their own reasons, those reasons being their own liberal politics. Gatewood's an uncanny presentiment. In this case, he's a banker, although the original of the character was usually an industrialist or a politician, as played by Edward Arnold in many Frank Capra movies. Besides his hypocrisy, he's a creep and a crook, one of those people who cloak their corruption in piety. Stagecoach began shooting on October 31st, 1938. The first 7 days of that schedule took place in Monument Valley. They involved none of the principal actors, just the stagecoach, a group of riders representing the cavalry, and so forth. In other words, only long shots were actually made in Monument Valley. Now, in this sequence, we're introduced to Thomas Mitchell's Doc Boone, who's an early example of one of Ford's favorite characters, the flamboyant alcoholic. Victor McLaughlin in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, or Edmund O'Brien in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, are some other examples. There are other, more restrained drunks also in Ford's movies. One thinks immediately of Victor Mature's Doc Holliday in My Darling Clementine. But Doc Holliday's a little too intense for laughter, whereas Doc Boone is really a florid ham actor, similar to Alan Mowbray's displaced Shakespearean in My Darling Clementine. Now, this scene simultaneously introduces Doc Boone and Dallas. Pre-production for Stagecoach was as carefully monitored as everything else. Ford wanted little touches of reality amidst the drama. He made a test of Claire Trevor modeling her plaid dress, but costume designer Walter Plunkett was horrified to see that her petticoat was clearly visible on one side. Plunkett said he'd fix it, and Ford turned on him, saying that he'd loved the idea that the dangling petticoat was a touch of genius, and that he regretted to see he'd misplaced his admiration for Plunkett's skills. Now, as they walk across the street here, the music mocks the dignity that Doc Boone and Dallas are trying to summon, or rather it mimics the false dignity they're trying to assume. We understand that Doc Boone is a scamp, a rogue, and from the sniffy looks on the pinched faces of the Moral Uplift League, we also understand that Dallas is a fallen woman. Now, the bartender is played by Jack Pennick, an old Ford hand who also served with Ford's unit during World War II. Now, there's really not much to this scene except it introduces the little whiskey drummer in the background. But notice how carefully Ford lights and stages it, with the ceiling, muslin, taking the place of a ceiling, and the sunlight coming through the window. It couldn't be shot with any more loving care if it was a crucial emotional showdown. Most of the film is equally carefully composed, but it never seems too terribly formal. Ford straddles the line. Now, Ford also shot a test of John Wayne and Claire Trevor to see how they photographed together, and he was unhappy with what he saw. He took Wayne by the chin, shook his head. "What are you doing with your mouth?" he demanded. "Why are you moving your mouth so much? Don't you know that you don't act with your mouth in pictures? You act with your eyes."
Well, how are you, Mr. Haycock? Oh, tell me, sir, I know a familiar name and another name. I never forget a face or a friend.
The whiskey drummer is played by Donald Meek, one of those delicious character actors of the 30s who essentially played one or two variations on a primal central part for around 20 years. He played meek, henpecked little men. Now, this Western street that Tonto takes place at is the standing Western street set at Republic Pictures, where John Wayne had been laboring in the mines for, these many years, ever since the failure of the Big Trail in 1930. Rather than build their own, they decided to use the standing street set and save some money.
I want $5.
Now, this sequence, we begin to understand what might be motivating Gatewood's theft.
Dinner's at 12 o'clock.
It allows us to imagine that he might be doing it to get away from an extremely tiresome wife. Burton Churchill, the actor who plays Gatewood, was an actor who specialized in grandiose windbags, but Ford tosses in this little moment so that the audience could perhaps sympathize with Gatewood, if they so choose.
All aboard for Dry Fort, Apache Well.
I think Stagecoach had more of an impact on the westerns of the 50s than it did on the westerns of 1939 or the 40s. movies like Delmar Davies' Broken Arrow, some of the Anthony Mann films with James Stewart and Gary Cooper, they actually pick up the ball that John Ford threw into play with Stagecoach in the sense of adult westerns with adult characters, with adult themes. And they deepen it. They go deeper than Ford did with Stagecoach. It's not a profound movie. The characters aren't deep enough. The situation is fairly stock. The situation per se is no different than any, 75 or 100 B movies. It's how it's mounted. It's how it's presented. It's how carefully it's cast. It's the quality of the actors, the quality of the photography, the quality of the direction. After the war, Ford went deeper with his westerns. A film like Fort Apache, certainly. You can argue about Fort Apache for hours on end now, not just in 1947, 48. But the westerns of the 50s, High Noon, and the seriousness of intent, the seriousness of the execution, that's where I think Stagecoach planted the seed. It didn't really come, the seed didn't erupt and come into fruition for another 10 years, though. John Carradine looks through a window and sees Louise Platt looking through the window of the Stagecoach. A great lady, he calls her. Maybe it's my imagination, but it seems to me that Carradine gives the line the same intonation that his friend John Barrymore would have. John Carradine, whom Ford once called to his face a lanky Galway son of a bitch, had a contentious, amusing relationship with the director for the next 30 years. Carradine told me how he got to know Ford. Ford was a peculiar man, he said. You had to know how to handle him. Actors were terrified of him because he liked to terrify them. He was a sadist. My agent had been telling me about The Prisoner of Shark Island, and I really wanted the part. Well, I tested for Ford, and we didn't get along at all. He was very cantankerous, forced me to play the scene his way, then let me do it my way. I was very unhappy, and I went back to the dressing room with the actor who tested with me. Well, I said, that's a job I won't get. The other actor said, you got the part. He hated me, I said. I'm telling you, you got the part. Well, how the hell do you know I got the part? The director's my brother. And he was. The guy I'd been acting with was Francis Ford. I don't doubt that the story's true. Ford always took a lascivious delight in baiting actors, even stars. It was one way to maintain the upper hand, despite the fact that stars make more money than directors. But Carradine almost never took the bait. John Carradine would play in several Ford masterpieces, including Stagecoach and his unforgettable Casey in The Grapes of Wrath, not to mention The Last Hurrah and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Now, John Wayne told me, referring to this movie, how Ford would make Dudley Nichols write a scene 4, 5, 6 times, then draw out those lines that moved the plot and created character at the same time, and you can see that painstaking craft in every scene. So much of the film takes place in the limited confines of the Stagecoach. So much of the relationships are intuitive, with glances and looks. It's very finely grained direction. But if you think about it objectively, Ford and Nichols are juggling 6 main characters, each of whom has an important part to play. Not every writer can do 6 seriously drawn characters in one script and keep the plot moving forward at the same time. There's great professional skill on display in this movie, and not all of it is John Ford's. Ford knew that he could take care of tone and take care of the images. But what Dudley Nichols is giving him is craft that approaches the level of art. After the first week in Monument Valley, the production moved to the Lucerne Dry Lake in Victorville, California to shoot the Indian chase. Since it was November by then, it was cold. Andy Devine said that he was never as cold in his life as he was on location for those days. The wind was blowing and there was a fine silty dust that got into everybody's lungs. After that, the company returned to the Goldwyn United Artists studio on Formosa Avenue for the interiors. The other exteriors were quickly shot on locations around Hollywood by carefully salting the Monument Valley footage throughout the picture. Ford thus gave the impression of far more extensive location work than the company actually did. Ford shot Stagecoach from October 31st to December 23rd, 1938, a total of 47 shooting days. 4 days over schedule, but for slightly less than a low A budget for this period. A B movie, a real B movie, the kind of pictures John Wayne was making, might run $40,000 to $50,000. An A picture at MGM would be running $600,000 to $800,000. Now, the cast, Clarence Trevor was the most highly paid performer. Tim Holt, who has, I think, 2 scenes, 2.5 scenes, and perhaps 10 lines, actually received more money for appearing in Stagecoach than John Wayne did. and the stagecoach descends into Monument Valley. The area around the valley was known for years as the Paiute Strip, but in 1922 the Paiutes headed north, and the land became public domain open for homesteading. Enter a tall, slender man named Harry Goulding and his wife Leona, generally known as Mike. Harry and his wife opened a trading post in 1921 and became trusted friends of the Navajos. The tribe, who'd numbered only about 7,000 in the mid-19th century when they were subdued by Kit Carson, now had a population of close to 100,000, many of them living in the Four Corners area. They came to trust the Gouldings as friends. Slowly, Harry Goulding accumulated enough capital to buy his land in 1936, but the Depression devastated the always fragile economy of the valley. The Gouldings and the Indians struggled to survive. The Indians couldn't sell the wool they got from their sheep, so they took to selling goat skins to get coffee. There was no food, no water, almost no rain. Occasionally, however, there was a movie crew. Zane Grey, the author, passed through the valley in 1913, and in April of 1922 he took Jesse Lasky and producer Lucien Hubbard on a trip into Navajo country, the Painted Desert, Paiute Canyon, Rainbow Bridge, and a few other places. The story of the Paramount picture The Vanishing American was conceived on this trip, and the shots of Monument Valley that were featured in the film were probably Gray's idea. In 1938, Harry Goulding heard that a Hollywood movie company was planning on making a movie around Flagstaff. It is at this point that history gets a little cloudy. In one of several variant versions, Ford told his grandson Dan that it was George O'Brien who saw Monument Valley first and came back raving about it. Harry Goulding had given him a lot of pictures and I was entranced, Ford said. Mike Goulding's story has her husband packing up a bunch of stills of the valley and driving to Los Angeles, where he presented them to the staff of Walter Wanger Productions. As it happens, the story was corroborated by photographer Joseph Munch, who remembered that Harry's original plan was to use simple snapshots of Munch's until the photographer offered to print up a batch of 8x10s and mount them in a spiral notebook. Mike Goulding distinctly recalled sitting in a car while Harry went in and told the secretary at the United Artists Studios that he wanted to see Walter Wanger. He didn't see Wanger, but was instead introduced to Ford, who examined the portfolio and told Harry, "I've always wanted to do a picture up there." When he first examined Monument Valley's 96,000 acres, Ford found the ultimate frame for his pictures. Sandstone buttes like fists punching through the earth's crust, as well as delicate architectural spires rising toward the sky. A place of majesty and repose. Monument Valley gave the impression that it is as it has always been, permanent, implacable, sacred. At night, clouds descend and settle over the buttes and pillars like gods visiting their creation. Even the watchful, uncommunicative Navajo people must have appealed to Ford. This was not Newhall, as much rural as Western. This was out there, a full 180 miles from the nearest railroad, with an endless series of compositional possibilities. Here, finally, were mountains to match the men that John Ford could put on the screen. And we are about to meet one of those men. From the stunning entrance that John Ford gives John Wayne, we can assume that he meant to make him a star. The camera rapidly dollies into a tight close-up as Wayne flourishes his rifle. This is the sort of aggressive camera move that Ford rarely used. Incidentally, that gun that Wayne just twirled is a large levered Winchester, a .38-40. The secret to spinning it and cocking it in the air like Wayne does lies in his being very large, 6'4", 6'5", which is the only way you can swing that thing underneath your armpit. Chuck Connors did the same move on TV in The Rifleman, and he was also very large. John Ford and John Wayne had been friends since 1928. Before he changed his name, Marion Morrison, generally known as Duke Morrison, had been in pre-law at USC and moonlighted at Fox Studios during the summer. He was working as a prop man when he accidentally walked into a scene Ford was directing for Four Sons. Morrison looked up, realized what he'd done, and ran away. Ford was entranced by the big kid and called him back. Morrison was sure he was about to be fired, but instead, Ford just told him to bend over, kicked him, and promptly made him a part of the Ford unit. You can see the young man in a cameo in Ford's exquisite IRA movie Hangman's House, shot a few months later. Wayne worked as a prop man, a stunt man, a camera assistant, and everything else you can think of for Ford and a few other directors in the next few years. In 1930, Raoul Walsh chose him as the lead for his 70mm epic, The Big Trail, and rechristened him John Wayne. But The Big Trail was a financial failure, and Wayne spent most of the next decade making 4- and 5-day westerns at Monogram and Republic, never getting the chance to star in another A picture. By 1938, he was 31 years old, a hard-working man who was beginning to believe that perhaps he'd never get another chance at stardom's brass ring. John Ford has perhaps been given a bit too much credit for creating the man who usually called him either Pappy or Coach, while the John Wayne of 1932 or 33 has little offer other than his personality. The John Wayne of 1937 and 1938 is greatly improved, acting with authority and concision, even if he was usually marooned by Republic's hopeless scripts. What John Ford is doing in Stagecoach is providing a setting in which this rough jewel can shine. Forged by years of working for little money and less acclaim, John Wayne was now a complete professional. Like Ford 20 years before, he had propped, he'd stunted, he'd worked for the worst directors. He was about to work for the best. He would always cast an eagle eye on all the various crafts that make up a motion picture crew. He was the first man on every set he worked on, always knew his lines and expected from others the same level of skill he demanded from himself. He never put on airs. As the cameraman Burt Glennon would remember, I've seen him put his shoulder to a location truck that was stuck, or hold a pair of shears and a comb for a hairdresser when she had to make a hurried change on one of the characters. The relationship between Ford and Wayne was already deep by this time, part father-son, part demon-mentor. Duke paid quite a lot of attention to him, said Ben Johnson, and Ford demanded that. Mike Wayne, John Wayne's oldest son, would remember that he often asked for and took Mr. Ford's advice on things, both with respect to his personal life and also his career. Whenever Ford wanted him, all he had to do was crook his finger and my father came running. They weren't politically aligned at all. Ford was a big Democrat, and of course my father campaigned for Richard Nixon, so they had their differences. But on screen, there was a seamless meld between what Ford wanted and what Wayne could provide. Ford sensed that Wayne could command a scene simply by entering it. He loved the way he could communicate complex emotions without using too many words, the undemonstrative way he expressed attraction to a woman. The screen character the two men began carving with Stagecoach was in most respects similar to the part Ford played on a film set, strength and isolation in equal measures. Ford had discovered him, and now he made it his job to shape Wayne into a film hero, a character big enough to embody civilization's conflicting desires. Now, you might have noticed that Wayne's costume is actually more farm boy than gunslinger. He's wearing blue jeans, they're turned up at the bottom, he's wearing suspenders, and so forth. It's actually very close to the kind of costume Harry Carey wore for John Ford. Wayne took the hint and tried to adopt Carey's gentle reticence as the keynote of his performance, although his reticence ended when anger was aroused or when somebody needed defending. Before Stagecoach, John Ford was a director with a great flair for filmmaking in either of two styles: American Pastoral, as represented by Judge Priest, Steamboat Round the Bend, The Iron Horse, and some others, and German Expressionism, as represented by Hangman's House, Four Sons, or The Informer. But in Stagecoach, Ford achieves a harmonious degree of control over his style. It is not, except in details, a poetic film. As Lindsay Anderson noted, Stagecoach is above all about narrative. Its excellence is the excellence of masterly narrative prose, taut dynamics. Stagecoach is populated by familiar characters: the good bad man, the whore with a heart of gold, the drunken doctor, the courtly southern gambler, that were actually old when Ford made the film. But he invigorates them, makes them seem fresh, by his eye for detail and color and characterization, and by the simple urgency of the film's ceaseless narrative. Ford was always a great director of landscapes, but Stagecoach shows how good a director he was of actors, how alert he was to the happy accident, and how adept he was at causing happy accidents to happen on a John Ford set. With Stagecoach, Ford found a subject that meshed perfectly with his calm style. It was the beginning of his being able to mesh his high art style, The Informer, for instance, with the more casual, less self-conscious style he adopted for his Will Rogers pictures. Ford had been experimenting with 2- and 3-plane composition for some time, often holding sharp focus throughout. His collaboration with Greg Toland in the next year or so on The Long Voyage Home and The Grapes of Wrath would extend this style further. But Stagecoach is a more integrated example, one of the reasons Orson Welles looked so intensively at the film before embarking on Citizen Kane. That influence would be seen in many shots throughout Kane, the use of stretched muslin to represent ceilings, for instance. But like anybody else, the influence could lie dormant for decades. The sequence in Stagecoach where John Wayne and Claire Trevor walk through the town, with the music changing as they move down the street, would be echoed in Wells's Touch of Evil. Stagecoach's style is particularly suited both to Ford's aesthetic and emotional sensibilities, meditative compositions and depth, usually medium shots, which give the characters room to react to each other within the shot. Just as it gives the actors more to work with, it gives the studio less. From this point in his career, Ford's camera would be predominantly still, so that when he does move it, the sudden whip pan to the Indians on the cliff, the furious tracking shots during the attack itself, the simple fact of the movement adds excitement to the scene. Ford had been born just outside of Portland, Maine in 1894, the son of a saloon keeper and a very minor functionary in the Democratic Party. He'd initially gone to Hollywood for a visit with his big brother Frank, better known as Francis Ford, who is at present in the scene with Doc Boone. Frank played tosspots for his brother after his starring career ended. In his early days, Frank was a knife-edge profile, a very successful leading man and director in the early silent days. Ford, as it turned out, liked Hollywood, and he had a natural affinity for the multitude of crafts that make up the movie business. He worked for Frank as a prop boy, assistant director, and general dog's body. Soon after directing his first film, Jack Ford, that's how he was billed in those days, quickly drew notice for his gift for landscape and the common man. The westerns Ford made with Harry Carey are notable for their relaxed, easy flow, their companionability, as well as Ford's gift for capturing the natural world. There's Frank Ford there, with the old Union soldier's cap on, obviously 6 sheets to the wind.
That philosophy, sir, I've always courted danger.
Ford was with Universal from 1916, then signed with Fox in 1920. He stayed there with time out for some remarkable service in World War II until 1946. In the silent days, Ford was a reliable commercial director, sometimes a bit more. The Iron Horse in 1924 certainly showed what he was capable of, but Ford shied away from seizing power and went back to making what amounted to programmers, good ones, but films that could never be truly distinguished because of their nominal stories and cast. There were a few exceptions, the aforementioned Hangman's House, a visually gorgeous story of an IRA man's return to Ireland that was made while Ford was very much under the sway of the great F.W. Murnau. It's full of long tracking shots in the manner of Sunrise, and in fact, redresses a couple of Sunrise's sets. The early years of sound continued his pattern as Ford would alternate major pictures, like Aerosmith, with very minor pictures. But in the mid-1930s, he began to assert his great gift in a more consistent way. He won his first Academy Award for direction for The Informer in 1935, and had directed the innovative The Lost Patrol the year before that. Both of those were at RKO. At Fox, his home studio, Ford made a trio of lovely films with Will Rogers, Judge Priest, Steamboat Round the Bend, and Dr. Bull, that were a kind of evolution of the Harry Carey westerns. Ford played a man of the people who rose to a position of authority by dint of his humanity, knowledge of human nature. Ford's personality was quite distinct from his artistic personality. He'd already devised the curmudgeonly, curt working persona that would become legendary and can be seen in its final flowering in Peter Bogdanovich's documentary, directed by John Ford. Now, in addition to his contract with Fox at this point, Ford also had a deal with Pioneer Pictures, a company formed by Marion C. Cooper and Jock and Sonny Whitney to emphasize Technicolor. Pioneer merged with Selznick International, but David O. Selznick didn't want to make a Western starring John Wayne, who was thought to be a B-movie actor. The result was that Cooper quit Selznick's organization and went out with Ford to make Stagecoach with Walter Wanger. Later, they formed Argosy Pictures together. Throughout production, all the actors had to be on the set all the time, whether they were scheduled to work that day or not. The enforced intimacy created a family atmosphere. People got to know each other while sitting and talking. Most of the actors' work in a John Ford film was done during rehearsal and blocking. Ford took longer to rehearse than most directors, but it enabled him to get a printed scene quickly. This entire dinner scene is played with immense delicacy by everybody. The story and the characters are sketched in broadly, almost with charcoal. But the way it's played moment by moment, Ford's handling of his people, is very gracefully done, a very delicate watercolor wash. Now, throughout production, Ford rode Wayne mercilessly. He was a big oaf, a dumb bastard. Claire Trevor remembered that he was very tough on Wayne, very tough. I felt sorry for Duke because he wanted to succeed so badly, and this was his big chance. Duke took it. He took it like a soldier because he knew he was helping him. One day, Ford allowed Wayne to look at the rushes and asked him what he thought. "Oh, wonderful," said Wayne. Ford asked about the other actors. Wayne also thought they were wonderful. Wasn't there anything he found wanting? Casting about for something insignificant and safe, Wayne mentioned that the reins that Andy Devine was holding seemed a little loose. They needed more tension if he was to convincingly play a man guiding 6 horses. Ford immediately yelled, "Come on down, everybody! Our star thinks he's fine, but he can't stand Devine's performance." This was the sort of stunt Ford would spring on the unwary for the rest of his career. It provided the spur for Ford to work Wayne over every day during the production until even Tim Holt told Ford to stop picking on Duke. It didn't help. Ford kept picking on Duke for the next 34 years. At the same time that Ford was making Wayne's life miserable, he's taking care of him. Anytime there's a chance for a reaction to a moment in the film or another character, Ford uses a shot of Wayne, making his response the focal point of the scene. Wayne would loyally point out that Ford only harassed him about minor things, his walk, the way he washed his face in a throwaway moment. But when I had a scene to do, he said, he treated me like a baby, which was really his style. He'd do anything to get a performance. Ford explained to Wayne that context was everything, that he didn't really have to express all that much, that the audience would read into him whatever emotion the scene indicated. A sound man remembered for a scene Wayne had particular difficulty with, and exasperated Ford finally said, "Just raise your eyebrows and wrinkle your forehead." It was a mannerism that worked so well that Wayne used it for the rest of his career. Of all the actors, Thomas Mitchell seemed the best able to handle Ford. When the director began riding him one day, Mitchell silenced him with one sentence, "Just remember, I saw Mary of Scotland." Until Harry Goulding sold the Lodge in 1963, Ford used Monument Valley more than any other location. Aside from its innate beauty, he loved the isolation. No interfering executives, no family pressures, no telephones, no competition for the position of authority figure. In Monument Valley, Harry Goulding was the location liaison because of his fluency in Navajo. Ford would explain the scene, then follow Harry out as he showed him a couple of likely spots. Ford came to regard the Gouldings as more than a necessary part of his filmmaking mechanism. They were friends. Monument Valley added yet another component to Ford's extended family, the Navajo of the Four Corners area. Now he would always have Indians he knew and trusted to play parts in his westerns. The qualifications were simple. The Indian had to ride well, and most importantly, he had to have what Ford called a great face. This last minute or so of images, they're beautiful, certainly, but consider how they indicate Ford's radiant self-confidence in his ability to hold an audience's interest with a narrative abstraction. They're leaving civilization behind, and they're setting off into the wilderness quite alone. Shortly before John Ford began negotiations to make Stagecoach with David Selznick, he invited John Wayne for a weekend on his boat, the Ariner. Wayne expected to find the usual gang of reprobates, but he was alone with Ford. The director handed him the original Haycock story and the Dudley Nichols adaptation. What, he wanted to know, did Wayne think of the story? Now, Wayne could tell that he was a natural for the part of the Ringo Kid. He could also tell that Ford was not about to give him the part. Ford and Wayne played cards. They drank. Finally, Ford got to the point. "You are acquainted with some of the new young actors. I was wondering if you knew of one that could play the Ringo Kid." Tired, irritated, Wayne mentioned Lloyd Nolan. Now, this was not as lunatic an idea as it sounds now. Nolan had starred in several big westerns in this period, including King Vidor's The Texas Rangers and Frank Lloyd's Wells Fargo. Nolan. Jesus Christ, Ford said. "I wish to hell I could find some young actor in this town who could ride a horse and act. God damn it, Duke. You must know somebody. But then you've been out at Republic. You're not likely to see a hell of a lot of talent out there." Ford got up and said goodnight. For the rest of the weekend, he baited Wayne with cracks about abysmal westerns at Republic and his casting difficulties with the Ringo Kid. Finally, as the ship was pulling into San Pedro Harbor, Ford said, "Duke, I want to tell you something. I've made up my mind. I want you to play the Ringo Kid." Of course, Ford had intended to cast Wayne the entire time, probably from his first reading of the story. The game playing Ford indulged in was intended to create a complete awareness of Ford's power and his significance. And there was another aspect. The way such behavior could focus an actor's attention away from himself and his career and onto the part and the picture where it belonged. He knew what he was doing, Wayne would say years later. First of all, he was making me feel emotions. He knew he wouldn't get a good job out of me unless he shook me up so damn hard I'd forget to worry about whether I was fit to be in the same picture with Thomas Mitchell. Mr. Ford only wanted to do one thing, and that was to make good pictures. To do this, he would do anything. anything. Marion Cooper told Ford he could commit to both Wayne and Claire Trevor, a minor actress at Fox who'd created a stir in William Wyler's Dead End. Now, hold that thought. I'd like to point out something here about Ford's improvisational abilities. Because the movie was starting production so late in the year, there was the risk of bad weather, and as you can see, one morning the company awoke to find that it had snowed overnight in Monument Valley. Everybody panicked, as there was no mention in the script of snow. Not only that, but since Ford and the company were basically just shooting long shots, it would be extremely difficult, not to mention time-consuming, to shovel the snow out of camera range. Ford couldn't have cared less. The story of Stagecoach was of a long voyage through hostile territory. A little snow wouldn't faze anybody. Ford got some shots of the Stagecoach moving through the landscape dusted with snow. Then, back at the studio, he tossed in a line for Andy Devine's Stagecoach driver to explain it. This was typical Ford. There are no problems, just opportunities, he would tell people. The ability to improvise solutions to apparently intransigent problems is the hallmark of every great director, or for that matter, every great general, to whom a film director is somewhat analogous. Okay, now we're going to return to the confrontation with David Selznick. He loathed the project. First, there were no big stars. Secondly, it was just another Western, a genre in which he had next to no interest. Why not do something else, he asked the two men, a classic. Ford and Cooper mounted a counteroffensive. Ford could be very articulate when he chose. They explained that the story was nothing but a vehicle into which they would inject a group of characters. The characters were classics, they said, so the picture could not help but be a classic. Cooper pointed out that the picture would have the most appealing love story in the world, the growing love between a good bad man and a good bad girl, a surefire star-making formula. Selznick gave in and said they could make the picture, but the next morning he reneged. It wouldn't get its costs back without big stars, he said. What if he gave them Gary Cooper and Marlene Dietrich instead of John Wayne and Claire Trevor? Now, Selznick was not completely off track. In the context of the late 1930s, Western meant little more than B-movie, and classic Western was practically an oxymoron. It was, in fact, a genre that would be invented by John Ford. Cooper and Ford had made commitments to John Wayne and Claire Trevor, and as Marion Cooper once said, I didn't learn anything really at the Naval Academy, except not to lie, cheat, or steal, and never to break your word, no matter what the cost. Cooper argued with Selznick for hours. Neither man budged. Cooper ended up by resigning from Pioneer Pictures on a point of honor. And then Ford and Cooper moved Stage to Lordsburg over to Walter Wanger. Wanger had gone to Dartmouth and never let anybody forget it. He'd produced prestige films at Paramount, Columbia, and MGM before going into independent production at United Artists, where he quickly ran into trouble. From 1936 to 1938, UA dropped $6 million into 9 Wanger productions and received not a dime of profit. Wanger had to scale back his spending. Have you noticed how good Claire Trevor is? Have you noticed that John Ford knows it? Because he's playing her in close-ups almost completely. And bad actors can't take a lot of close-ups, but he knows that he's on very safe ground with her. For Wanger, Stage to Lordsburg must have looked attractive. A prestigious director with a not terribly expensive property in a genre that, while it may not have promised enormous financial success, was a virtual guarantee against outright failure. One of the reasons that Ford liked working for Wanger was that he favored a hands-off attitude towards his directors, and he had a respect for Ford that was similar to Marion Cooper's. I read the story, Wanger wrote, the UA head of publicity, but after Ford had purchased it and brought it to me. Again, it was Ford who worked with Dudley Nichols on creating a fine script, and John Wayne as the Ringo Kid was also Ford's idea. While I'm proud to be the producer of Stagecoach, will you please do everything in your power to see that the picture is known as John Ford's achievement? Now, this, of course, was Wanger talking after it was clear that the film was a success. Before the movie was shot, he was echoing Selznick in his belief that Wayne's stock had been fatally devalued by nearly a decade of cheap westerns. Wanger, too, wanted somebody else, Joel McCrea, anybody. Ford even went so far as to test a few actors out of courtesy to Wanger. Bruce Cabot was put on top of the Stagecoach in front of a process screen for a sample scene. I went up to John Ford, Cabot remembered, and I said, well, Pappy, how did I do? And he said, you did great, Bruce, but Duke's got the part. Notice the dust inside the Stagecoach. That's an optical. They weren't actually using dust. That was added in post-production. Now, while all this was going on, Ford and Cooper were forming their own company. Ford had been tempted for some time by the possibilities of independent production. In June 1937, the trade papers had announced the formation of Renowned Artists, a group that would include Ford and Tay Garnett, whose film Trade Winds was supposed to be the initial release from the company. Renowned Artists fell through, but Ford and Cooper didn't give up. They chose for their logo a silhouette of a three-masted ship in full sail, and they called their company Argosy. This sequence at the way station is the first in a series of trials that all of the characters endure. In the course of the movie, we find out what each character is truly made of. There are no throwaways in this script that Nichols and Ford have constructed. I'd like to pay a moment's tribute to George Bancroft, who plays Curly, the sheriff. Bancroft had been a big star at the tail end of the silence, when there was a public taste for large, broad actors like Victor McLaglen and Wallace Beery. Bancroft had been, how to put this delicately, adversely affected by his stardom, and he grew difficult to direct. Now, by the time of Stagecoach, he was on the downhill slide to character actor, and in a few years he'd retire to be a rancher. My favorite Bancroft story comes to us courtesy of Bud Schulberg, who tells about Bancroft making his second movie for Joseph von Sternberg, The Dragnet, in 1928. Sternberg outlined the action. Bancroft, playing a gangster, was to be shot on a staircase and fall down. Sternberg called action. When he yelled bang, Bancroft didn't flinch. Sternberg kept yelling bang, bang. At the last bang, Bancroft paused as if having a vagrant thought. Sternberg finally called cut and demanded to know why Bancroft was ignoring his instructions. "One shot can't stop Bancroft," he replied. Certainly, there should be a small monument to Bancroft in the Cooperstown of movie stars who refer to themselves in the third person. I think it's safe to assume that Bancroft pulled no such turns with John Ford. Ford's crusty, just-a-job-of-work pose was, of course, a rather elaborate facade. In actuality, he was a serious man and a serious artist. When he wasn't directing, he was scouting projects, as in a memo he wrote to Darryl Zanuck about the time that Stagecoach was coming into being. The memo raved about Jean Renoir's Grand Illusion, which he called one of the best things I've ever seen. Ford suggested an American remake that would have changed the nationalities of the prisoners from French to English. Victor McLaglen, he suggested, could play the Jean Gabin part, J. Edward Bromberg the Jewish part, and possibly Romero or Niven playing the aristocrat. An interesting idea. Not a good one, but an interesting one. At Ford's recommendation, Zanuck saw the picture, but wisely thought a remake would be a fool's errand. "I feel that we could never get anywhere near this picture," he wrote Ford. It's a small point, but a powerful one. Ford, at this time in his career, was looking to better himself, as well as the industry he was a part of. Now, this sequence begins the process by which a disparate group of strangers begins coming together out of necessity. Dallas undertakes the role of nurse. Hatfield becomes the chivalrous male protector. Ringo pitches in, and Doc Boone actually has to be a doctor. Have you noticed the beautiful rough-hewn set for this sequence? It feels so authentically weathered, the bricks showing through worn stucco. The art directors were Alexander Toloboff and Ward Eyman, Edith Head's husband. It should also be noted that Ford obviously consulted on the set design. That long hallway that plays such a prominent part in the staging and these scenes would be too bizarre a feature unless he'd specifically requested it. Now, this sequence essentially is Thomas Mitchell's chance to shine. Mitchell was the most successful actor working on the movie. The same year he made Stagecoach, he played Gerald O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara's father. And he also appeared in The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Charles Laughton. Worked in Hawks's Only Angels Have Wings, and just to top off a rather remarkable year for a character actor, played in Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It should be noted that Thomas Mitchell got an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor in 1939. He could have gotten it for any of those pictures, but it wasn't for Gone with the Wind, or Only Angels Have Wings, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It was for Stagecoach, and it was well-deserved. Now, the cameraman on Stagecoach was Burt Glennon, a wonderful, wonderful cameraman who'd worked for Ford on numerous pictures before this and would work for Ford on numerous pictures after this. As late as Sergeant Rutledge, I believe, they worked together in 1960. Glennon was an all-arounder. One of the interesting things about Ford is that although he had a very specific visual style and was certainly one of the great stylists in American movies, his movies look different depending upon who shoots them. He did not impose a top-down style on his cameramen. He gave his cameramen leeway to work. Glennon's style, for instance, is a softer focus than Greg Toland's style with John Ford. Long Voyage Home and The Grapes of Wrath are both shot in an almost documentary style. Very sharp focus, almost or no makeup on the actors. This is a little bit more conventionally lit in terms of the period, but it's still, every shot is perfectly composed, And that is as much Glennon as it is Ford.
All right, Doc. All right. All right. All right, Dallas.
Now, this scene of the wife of the proprietor of the Stagecoach rest stop singing a song, it's the only scene I think you could make a case for cutting in Stagecoach. Ford seems to be vamping for time. I'm not sure why, because he could have just dissolved from the men waiting outside the room where Louise Platt's character is giving birth to the child being born. Maybe he felt he needed a lighter interlude from all the drama, although he does manage to make a plot point as the scene goes on, as it turns out that she's loyal to the Apache. As tough as Ford could be on men, he rarely gave his crew a hard time. Once in a while, he'd come down on wardrobe people, but that's about all. He didn't abuse actresses. He was actually rather formal and Victorian with actresses. Claire Trevor told a lovely story about watching a rough cut of Stagecoach with Ford. And after it was over, he turned to her and said, "It's going to be great. And you're so good in it, they're not even going to realize how good you are." It's true. Trevor was a freelance actress, so no studio really had a vested interest in promoting her career. Otherwise, she would have gone on to do more impressive leading roles. But she is the emotional core of this movie, and she does most of her acting with her wounded eyes. Now, it should be pointed out that Ford's sense that a serious Western was a good idea proved to be correct, because aside from Stagecoach in 1939, there were such films released as Fox's Jesse James, DeMille's Union Pacific, Warner's Dodge City, and let's not forget Destry Rides Again. Some good pictures in there, but there's only one great one. Now, Louise Platt was a contract player for Walter Wanger, and she was assigned the part of the pregnant cavalry wife struggling to get to her husband before her baby's born. She immediately got off on the wrong foot with Ford when she took offense at his emotionally rough-and-tumble atmosphere. Platt was the daughter of a Southern belle and a military man, so she modeled her approach on her mother. Southern women, she thought, were very strong, but they were never hard. Ford didn't like what he saw, and he took her aside. "She has to be hard," he told her, "hard as a rock. She wants only one thing, to get through, to get to her husband." And that, said Platt, was the only direction Ford gave her throughout the production. But Platt would also point out how Ford understood his medium. Now, in this scene, when Claire Trevor brings the baby out, Ford spent a long time getting the light to glint in Claire's eyes for the shot where she says, "It's a girl." From those 3 words and that close-up, Ford wanted us to know everything about her character. Whatever life had done to her, she'd be a wonderful mother. It was brilliant acting and brilliant direction.
It's a baby.
There's that close-up that he spent so much time on. Now, these 2 close-ups that follow of Dallas and Ringo, they make dialogue dispensable. It's really beautiful filmmaking. Notice in this scene that Ringo never takes his eyes off Dallas. He doesn't react to anything anybody else says. It's the sort of thing you miss on first viewing. Frankly, I missed it on my first half dozen viewings. It's just a subtle little detail that Ford doesn't want to point up. Otherwise, he could have had another character nudge Ringo and say, "Pay attention," and get a small laugh out of his infatuation.
Don't do that.
There's another touching little moment where all the men congratulate Doc Boone as if he was the father.
Dr. Boone.
And he's earned a drink after forcing himself into an unaccustomed period of sobriety.
Doc Boone. Hip, hip. Quiet. Well, we ought to be quiet. Mrs. Mallory. Oh.
Now, this scene in the hallway. Notice this superb example of deep focus photography that predates the collaboration between Ford and Greg Toland by nearly a year. Clearly, both men were moving in the same direction regarding the staging of scenes. For one thing, if you keep the entire shot in focus, you don't have to cut as much. You can, if you wish, hold on the master shot and bring people in from the background or from the sides to interact with actors in the foreground or the midground. This is not a new staging idea. It had been used in the very early silent days, for one thing. But shallow focus had been fashionable for over 10 years by this time, and Ford and similar talents were basically rediscovering the virtues of staging scenes in deep focus. He also does a lot, as you'll notice, with smoke, keeping something interesting happening, making the air come alive.
I think you stay awake here. 3 against 1 is no good.
That's a studio set at the Goldwyn lot. But notice the smoke hanging in the background, the aura of smoke. You can see it slowly moving around. Basically, it's to represent cloud formations. He uses low angles in this scene. I suspect he's trying to get some visual interest into it. One of the few scenes in the film that's actually pretty talky. Now, that fence that goes back to the vanishing point, it's a lovely shot. Ford would do something very similar in My Darling Clementine. It points out how the primary job of a movie director in this era was to make the space between the camera and the actor come alive. That was the mark of a visually creative director. Today, a visually creative director is someone who cuts very ordinary shots at the approximate rhythm of Eisenstein's Potemkin steps.
Why Lordsburg?
Now, Wayne said that if he actually had to do some acting, Ford would treat him very well. Mainly, he told him that he didn't have to express all that much. The context of a scene would steer the audience's reactions. Of course, that could depend on the quality of the filmmaking that the actor had to deal with. Certainly, with a very finely crafted script and direction, an actor has fewer worries than he does with rougher material and rougher talents. Now, Ford and Walter Wanger got along swimmingly. As a matter of fact, Harry Carey Jr., Dobie, was in the room once when Ford said that he thought Walter Wanger was the best producer he'd ever worked with. Why? Someone asked. Because he went on vacation when I went off to make the picture, and he got back from vacation just when I was finishing, Ford replied. No wonder he liked working for him. In fact, Ford would make only one more movie with Wanger, The Long Voyage Home. It's among the most stunningly photographed movies ever, but it was a commercial failure, and that dampened Wanger's enthusiasm for the wild colonial boy. They never worked together again.
Water. There's a cabin, half built.
The thing about Ford and Monument Valley is it wasn't just his favorite location. He would go there when he wasn't shooting. The Gouldings had a little stone cabin that was reserved for Ford's use. And he would go there not to scout locations. He would go there not to shoot a film. He would just go there to enjoy the Gouldings' company and to enjoy the valley, to enjoy the views, to enjoy the solitude. It's one of those places where you feel very close to God, or whatever you perceive God to be. And I think it was his favorite getaway spot next to the Arunner and the ocean. You know, Ford was probably right that Wayne had never developed good habits working in B-Westerns. The problem with that level of production is that the scripts are always terrible, and the directors weren't much better. Every actor has weaknesses, and if you're working with A-level talent, those weaknesses can be minimized or hidden altogether. The writers can make sure not to give you moments that give you trouble, or the editor can cut around them. But the problem with B movies was that there was no place to hide. Everything you couldn't do was on full display. But in Stagecoach, Ford doesn't place too many demands on Wayne's ability with dialogue. That would change on their next film, The Long Voyage Home, and change even more after World War II. But we do watch Wayne, and we do like him, and we react with him. His reactions become our reactions, and we follow him. That's something you could never get in a B movie. You don't have the time, you don't have the pointless details of performance that Ford is giving to Wayne. Now, when they were on location in Monument Valley, Ford was introduced to a Navajo medicine man named Hastin So, who could, Ford was told, produce any kind of weather needed. Ford promptly asked him for clear sky and snowball clouds. The next day dawned as requested, and Ford supposedly became a believer for years. He called Hastin Fat, because his name translates to Mr. Fat. Hosteen So delivered for years until one day he didn't deliver. Ford asked what happened, and So replied that his radio had broken. Now, this delicious story derives from Harry Goulding, so it's just possible that it's true. And if it's not, it ought to be.
Better get going for Lordsburg as soon as we can.
Might be a good idea, Curly, if Doc took a look at the patient.
This moment where Gatewood asks Doc Boone if he wants to have a drink with him, and Boone warily sides away and throws the drink into the fire and it flares up. It's a bit of business that would show up in at least one more John Ford Western. Now, this moment of Dallas braiding the new mother's hair, such a feminine, sweet gesture, such a lovely thing to do. I'd love to know if it derived from Ford or from Dudley Nichols. I don't think it's specified in the script, so it might have been a suggestion of Ford's or possibly a suggestion of Claire Trevor's. Now, you'll notice something's happening among the group. The baby being born is beginning to transform them. Doc is newly responsible. In fact, he stays sober for the rest of the film. Dallas has stepped up as well, and Ringo has fallen in love with her, at least partially because of the way she treats another woman's baby. We've sensed Ringo's vulnerability and tenderness before, but these scenes at the way station cement those qualities of his character. Ringo is the Ford hero in chrysalis form. His puzzlement at pomposity, his irritation at boorishness, his essential modesty would all turn up again in Henry Fonda's Wyatt Earp in My Darling Clementine, and John Wayne's performances in Fort Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. Some of those qualities, most of those qualities, would be inverted for Wayne's paramount acting achievement, Ethan Edwards in The Searchers. Only Gatewood continues to be indifferent to the altered environment. This new life that's coming into the stage to Lordsburg increases the sense of psychological urgency as well. This sequence in the hallway, Ford stages a lot of scenes in this hallway. It's a lovely feature. Mitchell's such a good actor. He's warm, he's sympathetic, he's always energetic. It's easy to have a character grow from almost comic relief, a genial tosspot actually, to a figure entitled to an audience's respect, as well as the character's respect, when you cast an actor with Thomas Mitchell's abilities. The warmth of these actors and the way they intersect keeps a fire burning in the heart of the movie. Some of Ford's movies are about sunsets. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, perhaps The Searchers. But in spite of the perils these people face, Stagecoach feels like My Darling Clementine, a movie about the sunrise.
He's not gone into Lordsburg. All I want is for you to tell me it's all right.
Gosh, child, who am I to tell you what's right or wrong?
All right. Go ahead. Do it if you can. But good luck.
Now, John Wayne had two names for Ford, Pappy and Coach, which pretty much synopsizes the relationship. Ford was the harsh, forbidding Vince Lombardi-style football coach who'd never hug you or tell you you'd done a great job. But for men like Wayne, men who never had a strong father figure in their lives, a simple nod from a man like that could mean more than a warm embrace from someone else. Wayne essentially spent the rest of his life getting a series of grunts and nods from Ford. These were two men who loved each other so much they didn't have to proclaim it. Now, in this scene, where there's a lot of haggling about whether they should go or stay or what they should do, he tends to play a lot of it in a master shot. He doesn't do a lot of intercutting. For all of his interest in deep focus, you'll notice that Ford makes Stagecoach one of his more cutty films of this period. This sequence, he plays a lot of it in his master, but not often. Now, Ford, of course, took great pride in the fact that he shot very little film, and he didn't shoot a lot of close-ups. As he once said, all you have to do to edit my film is cut off the slates and splice the shots together. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that. He did give coverage to his editors, but he did not shoot a lot of takes. I've examined the daily shooting reports for movies like The Searchers, and he would generally get a printed take in 4 or 5. shots. On a film like Rio Grande, he almost always printed his first or second take. There are very, very few shots that went as far as 3 or 4 takes. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a function of him doing a lot of rehearsal. He would spend an extra 10 or 15 minutes any time on a rehearsal, as opposed to shooting a lot of takes because he thought the actors got stale. Now, in this scene, instead of playing it in the master, he basically breaks it up into 6 or 7 separate setups. I would bet you that after World War II, he would have staged it more simply than he does here. It's possible that at this point he wasn't entirely secure in John Wayne's ability to sustain a lengthy scene, whereas in a few years he'd ask all sorts of difficult stuff from him, and Wayne would invariably deliver for his coach. Now, people have wondered about why Ford took off more than 10 years from making Westerns. Between Three Bad Men in 1926 and Stagecoach, shot at the end of 1938, he directed every kind of film except Westerns. Partially, I think it's because Ford didn't think in programmatic terms about where should my career be going. For much of his career, he regarded himself as a working professional, with pretensions that he worked very hard to conceal. If they handed him a Western in those early days, if it was at all decent, he'd do the Western. If they handed him a horse racing picture, and it was reasonably interesting, he would do the horse racing picture. He didn't think of himself in the same way that an actor thinks of himself, i.e., what does my public want to see me in? What Ford wanted to do was essentially keep busy. Movies were both vocation and avocation. They enabled him to get out of himself where he didn't particularly want to be. They enabled him to get out of small rooms and out on location in the fresh air with people that he liked to be with, stuntmen, crew, and the occupational necessity of actors. Ford loved the business of making movies, but also he loved the process of making movies. What he didn't like at this point in his life was sitting around the conference room or thinking in large terms about his career. He wanted to make movies. The more movies, the better. Now, have you noticed a great deal of the movie actually takes place in interiors? Interiors that actually are interiors, the inside of the stagecoach, or studio interiors that are meant to be exteriors. There's not that much location footage in the picture. In this era, going on location was a Homeric accomplishment. People running movie studios didn't want to send film crews on location because, as we all know, if the weather turns nasty, the costs start adding up, you can't shoot film, and before you know it, you are on pyramiding overtime and going far, far, far over budget, and then it's a constant struggle to get back onto budget. Whereas if you shoot everything in the back lot, you can invariably get your 2 or 3 finished minutes of film per day. Ford's urge to go on location predates Stagecoach. He wanted desperately to shoot The Hurricane, a film he did for Sam Goldwyn in 1936-37, in the South Seas, and Goldwyn initially agreed. And then, after Ford signed on to do the picture, Goldwyn changed his mind, and Ford was furious. For one thing, of course, he wanted to see the South Seas. This set, for instance, where John Wayne rides into on his horse and then dismounts, that's a studio set at Goldwyn, inside the studio. But it's very well crafted to represent the outside. You've got your foreground objects, and then a background plate, and then there's some stuff covering the joins, the cactus by Wayne's legs, for instance, to make it look a little bit more lively. Ford, by going on location to places like Monument Valley, was actually the leading edge of what would become industry practice after World War II, when audiences began to turn away from the very stage-bound style that people at MGM, for instance, favored, were Cedric Gibbons. Cedric Gibbons hated to send any crew on location unless it was absolutely mandatory. When they shot Mutiny on the Bounty at MGM, they wouldn't go any further than Catalina Island. This was typical for the industry at this time, in 1936 and the late 30s. After the war, it began to change. Now, the narrative vice is beginning to tighten. The walls are beginning to close in on those people inside the stagecoach. Now, when the film was released early in 1939, the critics raved. The critic for the New York Times wrote that John Ford has swept aside 10 years of artifice and talky compromise and has made a motion picture that sings a song of camera. It moves, and how beautifully it moves. Variety called it a sweeping and powerful drama of the American frontier. The New York Daily News said that every part is admirably acted. John Wayne is so good in the role of the outlaw that one wonders why he had to wait all this time since The Big Trail for such another opportunity. Even the Daily Worker was impressed, saying, "You'll comb the Hollywood hills many a day to find a more brilliant team than Walter Wanger and John Ford." Ford has done wonders with the material in this script. Ford won the New York Film Critics Award for Best Director of 1939. No small accomplishment in that year, generally regarded as the greatest in American movies. Claire Trevor remembered that, "I cannot tell you what a thrill it was. I expected it to be a good picture, but I didn't expect to be swept up and carried along with such joy. I was overwhelmed by this picture. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen. I forgot I was in it. To me, it was a symphony, a marvelous piece of work that used the motion picture camera in the best way that I'd ever seen it done. It used the medium so perfectly that it couldn't have been that good in any other medium." This, I think, is a key point about basically the movies themselves. They're not literary, they're not theatrical, they're something of themselves. And Stagecoach wouldn't have been a great novel, certainly couldn't have been done on stage, but as a movie, it's perfect. Basically, it was hailed as an instant classic, especially the 8-minute, 48-second chase that we'll be coming up to very soon. Yet, oddly enough, it ended up as a hit, not a smash. Still, given the reviews, the industry seemed to feel that the film had fallen short commercially. Variety noted that Stagecoach at the box office, quote, "has not sustained the enthusiastic reviews it received from the press. Lack of strong names in the cast and a trite title are the reasons given for the Stagecoach fade."
I need you. Can you give me your word you won't try to escape again?
I'll give you my word. To Lordsburg.
Get in the coach with them women.
I give you my word.
Ringo, don't!
Alice! Huck! Drive into the...
Stagecoach changed everything for John Wayne. The man who hadn't been able to get an interview with Cecil B. DeMille for a part was suddenly courted for leads by the same director. Wayne chose to develop a specific image, a screen personality that overlapped his off-screen personality, although not as much as, say, George O'Brien's or Harry Carey's overlapped theirs. Wayne's son, Michael, would say that he would analyze every script from the point of view of, is this what my audience wants to see me in? He would never trick the audience and deviate from playing a man with a code. Surprise, yes. Trick, no. And Stagecoach changed everything for John Ford as well. No more would he direct make-do projects, The Whole Town's Talking, say, or Submarine Patrol, which he could call a job of work. Now, this scene is a prime piece of movie industry trickery. The Stagecoach is actually about to be towed across the river. It was Yakima Knut's idea. Ford had been planning to jettison the sequence, but Knut assured him it was doable with a classic piece of magic. The logs are hollow props. The coach is being towed across the river by an underwater cable hooked to a truck. Now, in a second, you're going to see the shadow of the camera partially obscured by branches. The camera shadow is right there. You have perhaps noticed that the musical score isn't very interesting. This compendium of traditional folk tunes would prove emblematic for Ford. It didn't really matter whether the movie would take place in Wales, Ireland, or Oklahoma. Henceforward, in Ford's films, the music would be organized around folk tunes. Ford would tell his friends that he'd rather listen to good music than bad dialogue, but the gambit was about more than personal preferences. The music evoked a sense of the past, of tradition. Ford's directorial personality is fully accomplished in this point of the picture. Picturesque, ample, self-assured. And now we have another one of his remarkable shots, the whip pan to the Apaches on the cliff. Ford seldom moves the camera, so an unaccustomed move like that whip pan has a great impact. Now, Navajos are playing Apaches except for the one Indian on the right. That's an actual Apache.
Well, we'll soon be in Lordsburg. Sorry I threw off the handle, Hatfield. My apologies, Doctor. No hard feelings.
Here comes the chase. About 104 shots, nearly 9 minutes long. It's exciting, it's brilliantly shot. At the time, it seemed the ultimate in shooting and cutting, although the modern proponents of the vomit cam would surely regard the ration of 5 seconds a shot as far too slow. Now, Ford took the crew and John Wayne, the other actors were all shot back at the studio against a process screen, to Muroc Dry Lake near Victorville. Ford followed Wayne's recommendation and hired Yakima Knut, who had been working with Wayne on Poverty Row for years. Knut was to serve as the primary stuntman and horse wrangler for the chase. When Knut walked into Ford's office, he was greeted with, "Hello, Enos, how are you?" which immediately put him on his toes, because very few people knew that Knut's real name was Enos. Yakima was a nickname from his days as a rodeo champion. Before they started shooting, Knut had a tractor rig dig up about 15 acres of the lake bed to soften the soil for the stunt falls. Knut himself came up with the classic and still remarkable sequence in which he, as an Indian, transfers from a horse to the team pulling the stagecoach. There's the Newhall cut. Ford used precisely the same shot from precisely the same camera position in his very first feature film, Straight Shooting. Now, Knut, as an Indian, transfers from a horse to the team pulling the stagecoach. Wayne fires from the top of the coach and Knut falls, dragging his feet on the ground, holding onto the harness between the two lead horses. Wayne shoots again and Knut lets go, allowing the stagecoach to pass over him. It's still one of the most remarkable stunts in the history of the movies. What Ford was apparently unaware of was the fact that Knut had done the stunt before, at least once. The saving grace was that it had been in a Gene Autry B Western. Ford, and one must assume the vast majority of the critics, had never seen it, so as far as the audience was concerned, Knut's stunt was a breathtaking great leap, literally. It's been imitated many times, notably in the 1966 remake of Stagecoach and, of course, in Raiders of the Lost Ark. But each time it's done in short cuts. The audience never sees the stuntman do the entire stunt all in one piece, which is the key to the stunt. Now, the space between the horses' hooves was only 3 feet, and Knut was a big man, nearly as big as John Wayne. It was mandatory that the horses be running absolutely straight, and even then, there was very little margin for error. "You have to run the horses fast," said Knut, "so they'll run straight. If they run slow, they move around a lot. And when you turn loose under the coach, you've got to bring your arms over your chest and stomach. You've got to hold your elbows close to your body, or the front axle will knock them off." Now, for this stunt, Knut shows a section of the lake bed that had not been softened up, so the stagecoach wheels would not sink into the ground any more than was absolutely necessary. Ford was using 3 cameras on the camera car because he didn't like to rehearse stunts, feeling it made them look too polished. He asked Knut about speed. He wanted to know how fast the horses would be traveling. Knut figured 35 to 37 miles an hour. At the conclusion of the stunt, Knut, a good showman, added a little tag. As the coach passes over him, he rolls over and tries to get up, then collapses again, just to show the audience that it hasn't been a dummy. See how the ground has been softened and tractored up, so actually the stuntmen are falling as softly as can be imagined. Now here comes Knut. Now he's got a high stirrup on the side of the horse that's away from the camera, so he can get a high jump onto the horses. This is key. Back at the studio, on location, he falls. He flips over and he's on his back now. Stagecoach passes over him, he rolls over and tries to get up. That's it. Spectacular stunt. After it was over, Knut walked over to the camera car to find Ford leaning against it, looking at the ground. One of the cameramen said he'd missed the tag, a second wasn't sure, and the third thought he'd gotten it. Knut volunteered to do it again. "I love to make money," he said. Ford looked up. "I will never shoot that again," he said flatly. "They better have it." Now, you'll notice that during the sequence, Ford breaks direction. Sometimes the stagecoach is going from left to right, other times it's going from right to left. You'll also notice that John Wayne is the only one of the principals to actually be on the stagecoach. Now, the change in screen directions are something that audiences rarely notice, critics always do. Ford was always extremely defensive about any kind of perceived shortcoming, had a common sense explanation. It was getting late. If I'd stayed on the correct side, the horses would have been backlit, and I couldn't show their speed. So I went around to the other side where the light was shining on the horses. It didn't matter a damn. Now, there's Yakima Knut again, doubling John Wayne. You can tell it's Knut because he's thicker in the body than John Wayne was at this time in his career. He's about the same size, but he's a bigger, more muscular man, as he had to be to do these stunts. And then we cut to the close-up of Wayne on location, riding the lead horse on the team. Now, this entire sequence is a testament to the fact that you don't need computer graphics. You just need guts. And it gives you far more a sense of physical reality that you get in movies nowadays, even action movies. Look at these stunts. Think about what the scenes entail and how confident the stuntmen had to be. How confident Canute had to be about the guy driving the team of horses. In a sense, these men were a trapeze act. There are two people involved, the catcher and the flyer. The flyer swinging through the air is the one that gets the applause, but it's the catcher that no one pays any attention to who's half of the equation. In this case, the catcher is the driver who's making sure that the horses and the carriage are doing just what they have to, running very fast and very straight. Coming up here is a lovely little direct homage from D.W. Griffith's The Battle of Elderbush Gulch. The moment is the same. The white people are about to be overrun by the savage hordes, and a man is going to put someone he loves, a woman he loves, out of her misery rather than allow her to be captured by the Indians.
They're blowing the charge.
Now here's one of those fabulous cavalry trumpets signaling a full-tilt cavalry charge that every action director wants to shoot at least once before he dies. And the chase slowly comes to an end. I've mentioned how hard Ford could be on John Wayne and how seldom he acknowledged Wayne's excellence. Actually, years later, he was cornered, and he admitted that Wayne was, if not indispensable, to Stagecoach, important. Duke did okay, he said grudgingly. He knew his lines, and he did what he was told to do. Of course, I surrounded him with superb actors, and some of that glitter rubbed off on his shoulders. But he's still up there with the rest of them. He's goddamn good. And finally, we see Lordsburg. Now, Ford is clearly risking an anticlimax. After one of the great action sequences in the history of the movies, he's got another 18 or so minutes to the movie. It's the Ben-Hur problem. Your dramatic high point is the chariot race. It comes at about the 3/5 point. How do you keep the audience interested for another couple of reels? Now, the man that'll be playing the sheriff of Lordsburg a little bit later is a man named Duke Lee. Ike, one of the plumber boys, is played by an actor with the unlikely name of Vester Pegg. Both men had been part of the Ford Company in the early days at Universal with Harry Carey. And there are some other actors lurking around the fringes here who had passed through Ford's earlier creative life, Buddy Roosevelt and Bill Cody. Bill Cody had been starring in independent westerns as recently as 1935. Other small-part actors in these scenes include Helen Gibson, a one-time competitor to Pearl White in the serials. Now, Stagecoach finished shooting 2 days before Christmas, 1938. The finished film was previewed on February 2nd. Only one major change was made. In the scene in which Doc Boone implies that Hatfield shot a man in the back, Peacock suggested that the group sing a hymn, whereupon Doc Boone launched it into 10,000 Cattle Gone Astray, and everybody joined in. Ford cut the group sing, but he did manage to work the song into My Darling Clementine 7 years later. Stagecoach was released a month later, on March 2nd, 1939. The smoothly functioning, efficient assembly line of the studio system is one of the most consistently amazing things about that amazing era. It's nighttime when the stage and the cavalry pull into Lordsburg, and Ford keeps it nighttime. He could easily dissolve out and have the shootout, the climactic shootout, in the morning. That's one way to do it. But he keeps it at night. He observes the classic unities. I suspect he kept it at night for reasons of mood, to make it more foreboding, to make the scene between Ringo and Dallas, where she tries to reject him, but he refuses to be rejected, more romantic, and possibly to cover up the fact that he was working on the same set that he was working on at the beginning of the picture, the Republic Studios Standing Western set. Here we meet Luke Plummer, played by Tom Tyler, a star of dozens of B-Westerns in the 30s, as well as a year or two later, The Adventures of Captain Marvel, Shazam. Now, besides Ford's New Deal politics that are at such conspicuous play in the movie, there's a deep ambivalence towards society at work in Stagecoach. It's an ambivalence that never left Ford. It's on view in The Searchers, of course, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, to name just two later films. At the same time, there was no fiercer proponent of communal family values. This is the central dichotomy of Ford's work. Because he never resolved it, because it's essentially unresolvable, it accounts for the dynamic tension that provides the animating core for so many of his movies. With Ford, America and democracy grew out of the encounter between wilderness and civilization, and the West would be the meeting ground for the palpable and the possible. The complexity of the pictures he was beginning to make meant that John Ford's themes were, at long last, the full equal of his images. These moments are pure Western moments. The difference is that they're being directed by John Ford. So you get the lighting, you get the little pointless details. I think it's interesting that Ford and Nichols chose not to kill off Peacock, the endearing little whiskey drummer played by the endearing little Donald Meek. It's one of the reasons that, in spite of the fact that a lot of dying is done in the movie, it's largely people who, in the film's terms, deserve it, with the possible exception of John Carradine's Hatfield. This is one of the reasons that Stagecoach feels so affirmative, a long way from the far more fatalistic films Ford would make late in his life, where good people suffer and sometimes die alone. It's realistic, but it's far from the consoling visions that Ford gave us in this period and slightly afterwards. And consider the gentleness with which John Wayne plays Ringo. He makes all the other men in the film, with the exception of Doc Boone, seem crude and insensitive. It's probably unfortunate that Wayne became so identified with a monolithic, hard-bitten quality, the kind of part that he played in Red River, The Searchers, and some other films later in his career. But his size and his innate force as an actor make the kindness and gentleness he displays in Stagecoach all the more winning for being so unexpected. Now, Ringo is enlisting Curly's help to make sure that Dallas makes it to his ranch. Have you noticed that it never seems to occur to Ringo that he might be killed in the approaching gunfight? He's in the right, and he believes he'll survive to go back to prison for breaking out of jail. Breaking out of jail is a crime he seems to feel more justified in being punished for than in killing people who need killing. It may be a New Deal movie, but it feels like Old Testament logic. And there's Duke Lee, the man in the center, grabbing Gatewood. I had a 6 degrees of separation moment a few years ago, and I met Duke Lee's daughter-in-law and granddaughter, and they talked to me about old Big Duke, they called him, Big Duke, and how much he loved John Ford. So many people have wondered about why Ford acted like he did. The primary problem of a director in Hollywood is how to maintain control. It's not the director's money. It's often not the director's material. Sometimes it's not even the director's cast. So how is he to maintain control against actors whose egos naturally want to express themselves? How is he to maintain control working for producers who are giving him the project but usually have control of the editing or the project? One way to do it is by seduction. This is what a director like Ernst Lubitsch did. He seduced everybody into being his friend. He did it quite sincerely, but there was also an element of manipulation in it. Everybody liked Lubitsch, and since he usually worked within budget constraints, he usually got his way. Far more common is the director who maintains control by fear and intimidation. Ford, DeMille, Preminger. There's a lot of them. There are still a lot of directors like that today, and it makes a certain amount of sense. The associate producer will say, I don't want to have to talk to him. He'll rip out my lungs. You talk to him. That was the demeanor that John Ford presented to the world. Nobody wanted to make John Ford angry, and since it didn't seem like it would take much to set him off, people gave him a wide berth, which was exactly what he was counting on. He presented a crusty carapace to the world that very effectively hid an extremely sensitive artist. And beneath the level where that extremely sensitive artist lived, there was yet another level of a very self-contained, self-absorbed man who wanted to be let alone to make his movies. And making movies for Ford was the most important thing in his life. More important than his boat, more important than his love of the sea, probably more important than his family. In this scene, Ringo's resolute. He refuses to be chased off by Dallas. I suspect Dallas would rather be alone than have one more crushing disappointment, one more loss. There's Vester Pegg, the man in the center of the screen, the last one in the row, an old friend from the Universal days. Again, this scene has been played out in dozens and dozens and dozens of B movies throughout the 30s. Nothing unusual about it, except that John Ford has spent 90 minutes building up to these scenes. And he's taking his time. He's foreshadowing. He's showing us that Plummer and his gang are just a little jumpy. They never imagined they'd have to confront Ringo, and they're a little scared about confronting him.
I have that.
Oddly enough, Doc Boone's not scared at all. Possibly because he's already lost everything he could possibly worry about losing. His practice, his standing, his reputation. He doesn't really have much left to lose, except his life. And he doesn't seem to hold that at a very high price. He's basically looking at Luke Plummer, daring him to say something to him. Plummer's on the way to being cowed. Soon he's on the way to being dead.
Shotgun.
Now he asks for a shotgun. This is deadly. A shotgun is a killing instrument. Now this is a lovely little moment. The bartender's going to take the mirror off the wall. Notice that it's going to show the ceiling on the set. The ceiling's put there to hide the lights and the microphone that the mirror would actually show. A less painstaking director wouldn't use the mirror shot, but Ford was in a particularly careful mood throughout Stagecoach, and it shows. This is the walk through the town I referred to earlier. As they walk, they pass different neighborhoods, different houses, different things, and they hear different things. There's a honky-tonk piano. There's a baby crying. There's a whore sitting on a step. There's laughter, the piano at the sporting house. It's very similar to Wells's use of sound in Touch of Evil. Now, for the first time, Ford has parallel lines of action going. We've got Plummer and Doc Boone in the bar, and we've got Ringo and Dallas on the outskirts of the town. Now, unlike many of his pictures, Ford stayed with Stagecoach through the editing process. For instance, sound editor Walter Reynolds dubbed in a lot of war whoops during the chase scene, but Ford told Reynolds to take them out. Now, the promotional campaign for Stagecoach emphasized John Ford. The director of the Hurricane now gives you lusty excitement and a roaring adventure, as well as suspense. Due to the tremendous suspense developed in Stagecoach, we recommend that you get to the theater for the start of the picture. Now, unlike Thomas Mitchell or John Ford, John Wayne didn't get nominated for any awards for Stagecoach, so he couldn't win any awards. But things changed for him very quickly. Soon after the film was released, he walked into the Republic secretarial pool with a letter that he needed typed. Several of the women stood and applauded, and soon all the women were applauding the man they knew as Duke, who was clearly going to be a star. Likewise, Wayne had wanted to be cast in DeMille's Northwest Mounted Police and had gotten the brush off from the director. But after Stagecoach, DeMille began courting Wayne and finally signed him to play in Reap the Wild Wind, and even invited Wayne to eat lunch regularly at DeMille's own table. Although he stayed at Republic longer than he should have, Wayne's career ascended to an entirely different level as soon as Stagecoach was released. Now, I love this little scene. I love this truculent little alcoholic showing his true mettle. It's the kind of quiet gallantry that always appealed to Ford, especially if it could be played the way Thomas Mitchell plays it, with a waggish charm intermingled with strength. Now, he's talking Luke Plummer out of using the shotgun. I don't know how terribly believable it is that a man we know is a hardened killer could be talked out of his favorite weapon. But Mitchell and Tom Tyler almost make you buy it.
Don't ever let me do that again.
So he substitutes a rifle for the shotgun, thereby ensuring that he's about to get killed. This little montage that Ford mounts here of the streets clearing, of horses, of people running around saying there's going to be a gunfight, there's going to be a gunfight, is a cliche. But he gets away with it because of the quality of the images he's creating, and because by now we're so heavily invested in the narrative that we overlook things like that. Now, I love that. Shooting at the cat. It's something William Wyler used to say about directing B-Westerns in the silent days, where he started at Universal. Wyler said he would always have a dog standing outside the saloon set. If an actor kicked at the dog, the audience knew he was the heavy. If an actor petted the dog, they knew he was the hero. John Ford also started directing Westerns at Universal. I guess it was like a house rule. You always have the bad guy kick the dog or shoot at the cat. So it's 3 against 1 as we walk to the showdown. Now, the opening scenes of Tonto at the beginning of the picture were, as I said, shot at the standing Western town set at Republic, a set Duke Wayne knew all too well. It's possible that this is the same set. The darkness and reversing some of the angles would basically make it impossible to tell. The topography of Dallas's part of town, though, indicates that at least some of this sequence was shot on specially built sets at the Goldwyn lot. Now, you'll notice that Ford doesn't try to milk this situation with a lot of quick cutting. He's been building to this for 95 minutes. If the audience isn't interested by now, it's probably too late to save the situation. And he keeps it pretty realistic. The only way a man could kill 3 people in a shootout on the street is if they do clump conveniently close together as Ford has them, and if there's a certain element of surprise involved, hence the dive into the ground and Ringo getting off the first shot, which lowers the odds considerably. The details and the lighting that Ford gets into scenes like this must have been so luxuriant for John Wayne after years of bare-bones productions at Republic and Monogram, where, as he told me, you started shooting as the first rays of the sun came over the hills, gobbled a box lunch at noon, and you didn't finish at night until the cameraman said it was too dark to get good exposure.
Ringo.
Building up suspense, the gunshots ring out, we don't know who's alive, we don't know who's dead. We cut back to the saloon, and in walks Luke Plummer. Before he collapses, knocking over a spittoon. Nice touch. That's a Ford addition to the script. And the natural order is not only restored, the natural order is created. The Ringo Kid and Dallas are reunited, and shortly Curly will forego a $500 reward for turning in Ringo, saved from the blessings of civilization indeed. In some ways, Stagecoach is at its heart a B-Western, the best B-Western ever made. But B-Westerns didn't look like Stagecoach, B-Westerns didn't have casts like Stagecoach, and B-Westerns didn't have the egalitarian message of Stagecoach, that it is society's outcasts who do the hard work of American civilization, one of Ford's primary themes. Not only that, but B-Westerns don't have Stagecoach's audacity. The film really belongs to the ship of fools genre, in which a group of isolated strangers are forced into a confrontation and are therefore altered or at least exposed. That's why the casting of stars like Gary Cooper and Marlene Dietrich would have altered the chemistry and turned the movie into a star vehicle and away from the ensemble piece that Ford was determined to make. John Ford would make deeper films than Stagecoach, and he would make more virtuosic films than Stagecoach, but he would never again make one so nearly perfect, more filled with an easeful grace, with a perfectly inflected camera and characters. It's a film as pure and refreshing as deep breaths of mountain air. It's a movie in which all the elements seem to be in perfect equilibrium, in which no single component overwhelms any other. Cast, script, photography, direction, all exist in balance. There are very few perfect movies. Lubitsch's Trouble in Paradise, perhaps The Shop Around the Corner, maybe Chaplin's City Lights. I think you can make a claim that Stagecoach comes the closest to perfection of anything John Ford would ever make. I still like that picture, John Ford said near the end of his life. I do too, and it's been an honor to watch Stagecoach with you. This has been Scott Eyman.